a deeper pool that we can get into once we let go of some damaging beliefs. And one of those is that we can control the dream, and that we should control the dream. And that's what makes lucid dreaming special, or makes it awesome. And in a sense, this is sort of the toddler playing with the blocks. It's like, yeah, it's very important to realize that you have the power to move some building blocks around. That's step one. That's step one. And now let's look at the bigger picture, because what makes dreaming so fascinating is that we don't control it. It's autonomous.
Is this a dream?
It really makes you wonder, where do they come from? Where is this space?
Being lucid in itself is a superpower to me. It's just magic.
So I just kind of think, I want to fly at the fastest of fast possible.
The dream will automatically respond to us. It's almost like a kind of telepathy.
You could receive guidance and wisdom from these other dimensions.
This is something that's been used for thousands and thousands of years.
What makes dreaming so fascinating is that we don't control it. It's autonomous.
I think someday science will figure this out.
You can explore consciousness for yourself. You don't have to believe anything anyone ever says about it.
The main thing was just this feeling of complete bliss.
And I just felt so full.
I think it is one of the missing puzzle pieces.
Ladies and gentlemen of the multiverse, welcome back to another episode of Is This a Dream? A lucid dreaming podcast. I am your host, Adam Cotton, and this is episode 7. A little housekeeping up front. You can find the show notes for this episode and others at isthisadreampodcast.com. And you can also follow us at facebook.com/isthisadreampodcast and at isthisadream_ on Instagram. So here's the deal. I'm going to let you in on my plan for the maiden voyage of this podcast. I'm putting out around 7 episodes for this first run, and then probably letting it float for a bit at that point. It takes a pretty hefty amount of time and effort to produce each of these, and as of now, I am a one-man team doing this for the love of it, aka there are no sponsors. You can do the math there. Maybe someday, if it strikes a chord with enough folks, I can make it my full-time job and keep it going. I'm game for that. But in the meantime, let me know if you are enjoying the podcast and want to hear more. There's a contact link on the website, isthisadreampodcast.com. I'd love to hear from you. There's also a button there to donate via PayPal if the spirit moves you. Or another way you can help out is by leaving a review on whatever app you're listening with, which will help other like-minded people to find it. Or just listen and enjoy. That's totally fine too. Holy smokes. I enjoyed this one so much, and I really think you will too. In this episode, I'm speaking with lucid dreaming author, researcher, and educator Ryan Hurd. Although this is the shortest of the chats on the podcast so far, don't let that fool you. We pack a lot into this hour. Some of the things we get into include Western versus Indigenous views on lucid dreaming, shamanic dream battles, lucid nightmares, initiation and transformation in the dreaming space, ethnocentric concepts of reality and deities, shadow work, the autonomous visionary complex associated with dreaming, ancient rock art, acoustic archeology, trance states, angels, gods, demons, sorcerers, and some other stuff. For context, we recorded this pre-pandemic. All right, buckle up. We're going in. Oh boy, this is exciting. My very special guest here is none other than dream researcher, educator, and author Ryan Hurd. Ryan's recent research focuses on lucid dreaming, sleep paralysis, lucid nightmares, lucid dreaming supplements, and The Anthropology of Consciousness. He has presented to a wide range of audiences, including lectures at Stanford University and TEDMed. Ryan's work has been featured or quoted on CNN, NPR, Vice, Business Insider, Mashable, Psychology Today, and Gawker, among others. He is the author of several books on dreaming, nightmares, and states of consciousness, including Sleep Paralysis, Big Dreams, Dream Like a Boss, Lucid Immersion Guidebook, and Lucid Dreaming, New Perspectives on Consciousness and Sleep. Ryan is the founder of dream and consciousness research website dreamstudies.org, which includes his extremely popular lucid dreaming blog. He is a board member of the International Association for the Study of Dreams and frequently consults with tech companies in the wearable tech quantified self movement. He also makes these really cool Lucid Talisman reality check coins. I have one myself that I carry around. In his own words, my chief aim is to help bring about a new dreaming culture that integrates the best of 21st century thought with the intuitive ways of knowing prized by our ancestors, dreams, visions, and imagination. Ryan is a straight shooter whose writing and research is notably clear and concise. He is unafraid to explore and talk about subjects that tread on societal taboos and the darker sides of lucid dreaming, including lucid nightmares, sleep paralysis, and night terrors. His level-headed approach with a welcome sense of humor in these areas has led him to give presentations with titles such as How to Win Fiends and Influence Demons, Sleep Paralysis as a Portal to Extraordinary Dreaming. And I haven't fact-checked this, but I'm pretty sure he's also the only lucid dreaming author to quote both the Beastie Boys and Napoleon Dynamite in the same book. Ryan, welcome to the show, and thanks so much for taking the time to join me today to chat about lucid dreaming.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Adam.
My pleasure. So there are so many things I can't wait to ask you about, but let's establish a baseline here first with a quick reality check, which I love your expertise on. Is this a dream?
Let me check. No, I couldn't breathe when I held my nose, so apparently we are in waking consensual reality.
Okay, great. Then we can continue. I thought this would be a good place to jump in. In your Unearthing the Paleolithic Mind paper, which I'm probably going to mention more than once today, which is an incredibly mind-blowing work, by the way, you write, and I'm combining two passages here, quote, lucid dreaming to me is an experience in which I come to know I am within a dreaming landscape where the boundaries of myself and the environment interpenetrate in a dynamic flux of interiority, shared resonance, and mysterious otherness. A beautiful and mysterious process of self-organization that transcends my own waking consciousness. It sounds like you found a deep sense of harmony and balance in your dreaming practice. Can you unpack this description of your experience a little bit more for us?
Yeah, thanks. So interestingly, that passage got hammered out when I was writing my master's thesis. And when I really realized I had to do lots of definitional work. And maybe it's because I'm a Southerner. I was raised in Georgia, but everything comes down to sense of place for me and for Faulkner and the rest of us. But that's basically how I came to think of lucid dreaming, as lucidity is this sense of self, this sense of place, this landscape. And I guess the part of that that's a little controversial is that sometimes means including those proto-lucid moments where we might not have the thought, this is a dream, yet there's a sense of knowing that I'm in a magical place and I can fly, or I have extra powers here, or, that sort of, we step into a different sense of self, a different way of being. It doesn't necessarily include that, right, that literal verbal thought, this is a lucid dream, which is how lucid dreaming is defined. And I think that's fine to define lucid dreaming as having that verbal thought. But I think in actuality that the phenomena extends beyond that. I think that that's a laboratory effect that is convenient for us, but the phenomena extends beyond verbal knowing into this other kind of knowing. And so that's really where that came from. And what is important to me to describe that as is that we each have our own sensed knowing of what that landscape is like. And I think that it's very peculiar and individual to each of us. And because it's interior, it's just like I'm in my own space. And what does that feel like? And what is that landscape like? And so we can compare notes, but we are almost like in our own little caves, in a sense.
So, from what I've gathered through your research, writing, travels, and involvement with the Indigenous Science Network, it sounds like you've spent a considerable amount of time around a variety of different indigenous cultures and perhaps some of the shamans. Are there any lucid dream related cross-cultural common threads you've picked up on that may fall outside the scope of mainstream Western lucid dreaming philosophies, framework, and practices?
Well, that's a great question. So, to be sure, my work with the Worldwide Indigenous Science Network has been mostly giving academic presentations and interfacing with a lot of other Westerners often.
Okay.
Although I do work with some healers who are part of that program and part of that institution. And dreaming is, of course, cross-culturally important for the people that I've been talking with. But this is where my personal experience, there's a line, and then what I have read takes over. And the line is that there's a piece of indigenous, I'd say shamanic lucid dreaming culture that I've read about from, ethnographies and talking with people who have spoken with these people, such as Stanley Krippner, who you should have on your show, by the way.
Awesome.
Is that many people use these directed dreaming practices for not only the accepted practices of getting power, getting information, but also to do harm. There's a sorcerer aspect to these lucidity practices that the West doesn't want anything to do with. And so we see some of this in Malaysia. There's a lot of places that it exists. But, lucid dreaming is a place where shamans and dream specialists go into a realm and curse other people. And so that's something that Westerners really don't want to talk about or think about or open ourselves up to the possibility that this is more than a placebo. We'll take the rest about gaining power and gaining information, but we don't want to deal with the negative, what do they call it, the barbs that come that you hear from ayahuasca culture. It's a very similar landscape.
I'm really glad you brought that up. I wanted to ask you a little more about this exact subject, actually, because you had a passage also from Unearthing the Paleolithic Mind where you write, if we grant that lucid dreaming may be powerful enough to heal, then we must also admit that it may also be powerful enough to do us harm. Otherwise, lucid dreaming is not really the medicine so many would claim it to be. And I've spent a fair amount of time with shamans myself, and the standard view in Western cognitive psychology, and you even hear this from lucid dreaming people like Stephen LaBerge, is you can't be hurt in the dream world. And, of course, we've all had the falling dreams where you wake up with a jolt, but you're perfectly fine. That's one thing. But a lot of the indigenous healers that I've spent time with all seem to share the view that you just said, which is that they all urge caution, basically, and say, we're playing with forces and other things we might not understand or be prepared for. And they tend to have firsthand stories, which they usually qualify like this is something that's a lot more likely for a shaman to encounter because this is what we deal with. But of things that go up to the level of dramatic life or death confrontations in the dream state. So I was wondering if that was what you were alluding to in that passage. And I've definitely heard that side. And like you said, in the West, people don't want to consider or look at those types of things or think they're possible. So I'd love to hear you riff a little more on that.
Yeah. So there's two pieces. The first part is the dramatic piece about, how shamans are having shamanic battles in the dreamscape, which is absolutely a thing. We've got all kinds of ethnography that it used to happen and that it happens now in specific cultures, and so-called witches do the same thing. They call nightmares on each other. And so that's the perspective that we see in indigenous culture that's hard to reconcile with our worldview. And one of the things that in the same anthology of my essay about unearthing the Paleolithic mind and lucid dreams, Shayne Dahl, an anthropologist, writes about his experience working with the Blackfoot Indian cultures up in South Dakota. And they similarly have this sense of caution when it comes to, everybody go lucid because there could be dangers. And specifically, what the Blackfoot Indians seem to be saying is specifically for those people who believe in spirits in the first place. And that's where we have this rift again about how deep is cultural relativity. So does having a belief in voodoo make one susceptible to voodoo, right? That's the old kind of anthropological question. And if we just go ahead and say, oh no, I'm a scientist and I have a materialist view, and so does that thick boundaries somehow give us armor against those things? And this is where it gets interesting for me in regards to lucid nightmares and sleep paralysis, which often falls into the same camp in terms of level of intense death, anxiety, levels of fear, and confrontations with seemingly autonomous creatures who want to do us harm, perhaps, or that seems to be the intent based on the fangs and, the gnarliness, is that when we look at some of the research that, for instance, Shelley Adler has done, medical anthropologist based out in Seattle, with the Hmong people who came out of Cambodia in the 1980s. Have you heard about this? This is a really intense story about how essentially we had all these refugees that came over to the United States from Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, trying to get away from all the violence that was occurring in their homelands. And the United States had a immigration policy which was to basically sprinkle the family groups across the Midwest and across the West in general. And so often family groups were broken apart, which was devastating for families, for large intact family networks. A lot of these people ended up later converting to Christianity. But the big piece here is that there became a crisis in which seemingly healthy young men in their 20s and their 30s were being found dead in their bed with this frozen mask of horror on their face, as if they died in panic. And the cultural story that came with this is that they died because they encountered a demon that happened when they were being held down in their sleep. And so there's a very clear connection to sleep paralysis, and that they were encountering these demons. Of course, we can't talk to them and say, hey, what happened? Why are you dead? We can't ask that question. But what finally came out of this, by the way, this is a huge deal. I mean, dozens, if not hundreds of men were dying of this, and they're saying, why is this happening? And finally, it was revealed that there was a physical or biological component, is that these young men also had a heart defect that was, at that point, undetected. It is a genetic anomaly. It's very common with that group. And so it seems to be, when we reconstruct what happened with them, is that they seemingly had some kind of nightmare experience in the middle of the night, and they had death anxiety that was so great that it essentially ruptured or triggered their heart, and they died from this heart abnormality. And so this is where people say, oh, sleep paralysis can kill you. And apparently it did in this very specific case. And so that's really creepy. But Shelley Adler went even kind of farther into it, and she was, as an anthropologist, interested not only in the biology, but also in their religious views. Interested in what did these people believe was happening to them, how did they explain it, not how do we explain it, but how did they explain it to themselves. And so upon doing all of these interviews, she found that essentially there was this belief that because they had left their homeland in Cambodia, they were no longer doing the ancestral rites, the ancestral practices that keeps the ancestors happy, because they weren't visiting the shrines and going to the sacred places. Also, in some cases, they were prevented from doing ritual because where they were living were, like these apartment complexes. And some of their rituals would involve like sacrificing a chicken. You can't sacrifice a chicken in an apartment in Minnesota. You can't do it. And so they were physically prevented from doing some of their rituals. And so they felt they were letting their ancestors down. And the belief is that when you don't do these rituals, that the ancestors can't protect you from the malevolent spirits from the land. And so they seemingly felt that they were left open to this. And so there was this sinking feeling all around them all the time that spirits could infiltrate them. And then to make things even more complicated, a lot of these Hmong families were converting to Christianity, on their own accord, just because of cultural context. Some of it, was being shoved down their throat, but a lot of it, I think, was on their own doing. And so you have with these first-generation immigrants, often 2, maybe even 3 different paradigms existing simultaneously of the spirit world, the ancestral world, plus this new Christian vision. And so the way I put this all together is that when we have a crack in our belief system, or we have 2 or 3 paradigms coexisting, which is very typical for most of us, about the way that the universe is structured, the way that life works, that in between those cracks, that's where these openings to ultimate fear get in, because the paradigm essentially acts as a biopsychosocial bridge against these forces that, nocebo. They call it a nocebo effect. It's the opposite of the placebo. And so beliefs that can do you harm is a nocebo. And so that's the Hmong case, right? And it's so tragic and yet so illuminating to the human condition about what happens when we shift or we're in between paradigms. Oh, like the person who says, I'm a scientist, but then like when something goes bump in the night, suddenly the old fears from childhood come in about, oh, maybe there is ghosts, right? And so those are 2 different paradigms going. And that gap creates an opportunity for us to spiral into these kind of scenarios where we can get hurt. Not like the Hmong necessarily got hurt, but where we feel wounded by our own experiences. And we wake up feeling diminished and less than, and it affects our emotions and our relationships. And right? So, so that's a very interesting thing for me, is that mix.
Totally. It's such an interesting gray area there, and it brings up so many questions about things like solipsism versus autonomous figures, and there's just so much in there. I want to stay on this for a minute here because I heard a quote of yours on another podcast where the conversation was about encounters with angels, demons, aliens, and other types of beings during these sleep paralysis states, which I think can also be applied to encounters in any state of consciousness, be it dreaming, waking visions, psychedelic experiences, and so on. So your quote was, in my mind, there's this connection with aliens, angels, and other kinds of galactic creatures. And I kind of wonder how much of how we see the alien gray is a projection or kind of cultural garb, if you will, on an entity that has a much older existence. It's certainly true with lucid dreams and to some extent other sleep paralysis experiences that your attitude, your expectation of what's in front of you affects your perception of what you're seeing and experiencing. You can really project your fears and also your hopes onto the other, right? That mysterious other. So how much of that is our projection and how much of that is the true face of what we're with? And I think that is the big question. And this is me talking again. So there's kind of like this mirror of consciousness effect and us being connected with this larger consciousness that in a sense seems to take on these individualized forms that tie into the person perceiving them. And this is definitely the deep end of the pool that we're in here in a fascinating theory. I'd love to hear you riff a little more on this and talk about what you think is going on there.
Thanks. It's really interesting to hear myself quoted because I don't necessarily recall saying that, but I agree with it. So that's good. I don't think I'm the first to make the comment that angel and alien projections may be coming from a similar source. I'm certainly not the first to suggest that. One of my mentors who's passed on a few years ago is Jeremy Taylor, who's a dream worker based in Berkeley, California. He wrote a number of books, including Dream Work was the title. It came out in 1983, and he had a huge influence on the contemporary dream work movement of the 1980s, basically giving grassroots control to dreamers to say, hey, this is your dream. What do you think it means? And you can, self-organize and have dream circles, and you don't need a psychologist telling you what your dream is. We actually have the ability to do this ourselves as sentient humans and have forever and ever. So one of Jeremy's things that he always honed in on was this concept of projection, which you quoted me saying is how much do we project onto this other? And so projection being something we can't get away from. We can't stop projecting our own qualities, our own shadows, our own fears, our own expectations onto someone or something that we're in relationship with, right? That's just, it seems to be part of the whole humanoid, primate-based operant conditioning. So that's what we do. We project, and so we can notice ourselves projecting. We can set it aside and try not to be biased by it, but we can't really stop doing it. So Jeremy had this wonderful way of discussing how he called it sock puppet, basically like seeing the universe as this blanket, and then, a form comes up as a sock puppet, and then another form comes up, and we interact with these different garbs and these different faces of what is essentially oneness. And yet, because we are human and, primates and need to have sociality, like we need to project to glimpse larger realities, and we have to work with those restrictions. And I don't think the question can be answered, how much of is it a projection, how much is it something authentically beyond ourselves that we can communicate. I think that's what's so wonderful about that way of thinking is there's history. There's really no way to get to the bottom of it.
Hey, guess what? It's time for a segment. It's segment time. One of my favorite offbeat movie heroes, Buckaroo Banzai, once said, "No matter where you go, there you are." If we really think about it, our experience of this world is often subjective. We perceive most things through a lens colored by thousands of experiences, a lifetime of moments strung together that are unique to each of us. Although we don't know everything about dreams, one idea that many current dream theorists seem to mostly be on the same page about is this. Although there are universal commonalities in dream content and themes around the globe, the way we experience and ultimately interpret our own dream content is personal for each of us. Joseph Campbell famously wrote, "Dream is the personalized myth. Myth, the depersonalized dream. Both myth and dream are symbolic in the same general way of the dynamic of the psyche. But in the dream, the forms are quirked by the peculiar troubles of the dreamer." Whereas in myth, the problems and solutions sown are directly valid for all mankind. In each of our personal stories, notable people, places, events, and things carry unique meanings based on our history and relationships with them. For example, many people have an aversion to snakes, but a small percentage feel an affinity and keep them as pets. The dreams of a snake caretaker versus those of someone with a strong fear of snakes will naturally be different in experience and interpretation. In addition to one's personal mythology, dream studies have consistently shown the expectations of the dreamer play a very immediate role in what happens next at any given moment. As author Claire Johnson puts it, dreams are thought-responsive environments. Let's take another cold-blooded creature as an example, the shark. Ever since Jaws came out, a fear of sharks when swimming at the beach is something many of us have experienced. Now, you probably know that shark attacks are extremely rare. If you live in the United States, your chance of dying by shark attack is actually 1 in 264.1 million. To put that into perspective, you have a 1 in 127 chance of dying from a fall, a 1 in 63,225 chance of dying from contact with hornets, wasps, or bees, and a 1 in 161,856 chance of death by lightning strike. Which means you are still 1,600 times more likely to be charred by lightning than munched for lunch by Jaws. But of course, fears are not rational, and although it's a beautiful day at the beach, part of your lizard brain is convinced it's very possible you could be on the appetizer menu of the local monster. The truth is, in the waking world, chances are extremely high that you're going to be fine, even if your fears or expectations are telling you otherwise. However, if you are dreaming, happen to find yourself in the ocean, and have a similar thought, oh boy, I hope there's not a shark out here because I'd be in a lot of trouble. Unfortunately, in dreamland, the chances of that fin and subsequent hungry sea beast being the next thing you see and have to deal with are extremely high. Expectations are like immediate new script lines for the invisible dream director, always hooked into your subconscious. Author Robert Wagner writes, lucid dreaming exists as a mentally dynamic state and often reflects back to us our beliefs, assumptions, feelings, and expectations. The good news here is when you bring your awareness into dreams and harness it, this expectation effect is still intact and can be used to your advantage. For example, with a little practice, you could use expectation in the above scenario to realize that fin actually belongs to a dolphin, who is going to be your ocean buddy and teach you about swimming. Whoa. And maybe even give you some advice about a difficult situation in your life that you are dealing with. So, why not ask him? Here's the thing. Buckaroo Banzai was onto something. Besides the ridiculous-looking, ill-intentioned aliens in the 8th dimension. No matter where you go, you take your memories, expectations, emotions, and thought patterns with you. Although this may seem like stating the obvious, in the dream world, all these things that make you are amplified. Wherever you go, there you are. Once we shine the light of awareness into the darkness of our personal mythologies, become familiar with the territory, and start to act with consciousness rather than react with unconsciousness to whatever we may encounter, it is said that whole new worlds and even whole new ways of being will open up to us. And we're back. I wanted to mention, and I think I've heard you talk about this before, Carl Jung, although familiar with lucid dreaming and its potential, famously avoided highlighting it out of a fear of Westerners using it to further feed their hungry egos. And you have framed this idea as what I find to be a very thoughtful and valid concern about the dangers of colonizing the dream space. And I'd like to read another combined passage from Unearthing the Paleolithic Mind on the subject of lucid dreaming here. Quote, "Overall, our work as modern humans is to integrate these powerful and ancient neurological trends and work around their limitations with modern traditions and beliefs. This is not necessarily progress, as our own worldviews have their own ensnarements. Euro-American style lucid dreaming is influenced more by marketing language selling to a common denominator and powered by the American values of manifest destiny and, deeper still, colonial schemes of conquest than the skill of dream manipulation as practiced in Eastern esoteric communities or the complex soul travel actions performed by shamanic practitioners. Still, I would suggest that most modern lucid dreamers are playing in the shallow end of a very deep and ancient pool that not only has powerful psychosomatic powers, both positive and negative, but is also home to some strange bedfellows like encounters with incubi and ancestral spirits." End quote. Can you talk a little more about this and maybe riff a little on why it's important and how we in the West can maybe avoid falling into this type of behavior and perhaps what a healthy, positive approach to carrying ourselves in the dream world would look like?
Yeah, you bet. I mean, it's the Me Too movement for lucid dreaming, right? You have to own your privilege. You have to own your projections. And realize that, lucid dreaming as it's sold to us is so different. It's such a small piece of the puzzle of what the experience could be, even for us as Westerners, even if we're not esoteric, mystics or shamans. There's a larger pool, a deeper pool that we can get into once we let go of some damaging beliefs. And one of those is that we can control the dream and that we should control the dream. And that's what makes lucid dreaming special or makes it awesome. And in a sense, this is sort of the toddler playing with the blocks. It's like, it's very important to realize that you have the power to move some building blocks around. That's step one. That's step one. And now let's look at the bigger picture, because what makes dreaming so fascinating is that we don't control it. It's autonomous. We come into contact with something that's greater than ourselves, something we don't know. We learn things. We see things from a different perspective. We uncover memories that we had forgotten. We uncover parts of ourselves that we have forgotten. And so that damaging attitude of lucid dreaming simply as dream control, I think really holds us back, and it's held us back for quite some time. And so we keep going back, and I'm not the only one for sure that talks about this. Even Stephen LaBerge, as early as 1985 was saying, hey, control yourself, don't control the dream. It's a marketing language. And it's manifest destiny. And guess what? It's not an unpopulated wilderness. There's creatures already there in the dream. We are already there. We belong there. And underneath that American sensibility is this colonial aspect. And Freud was right there 120 years ago talking about how we need to drain the swamp. He used that language talking about the dream work.
Wow.
Doing his practices was, in a sense, some kind of draining and creating new landscapes. And so it's tough. It's tough because that's a difficult projection. You got to realize that we can't really get rid of that one too. We have to work with it and find a middle way. And for myself, that middle way has been definitely influenced by, eco-psychology and wilderness therapy, as well as like looking at what other cultures have done. And that is because it's very simple stuff coming down to respecting the dream, coming down to ask a question. That's the push piece of lucid dreaming, and then make a space for the answer. Sit back. What emerges? Right? What shows up? Who shows up? And respecting who shows up, especially when it's unexpected. So, and these are values, but in the dream, it's difficult. It takes some time, and it's scary to be open in the moment and to not know what's happening. But we become more comfortable with that level of ambiguity the more that we do it. And I think that's sort of the secondary skill of lucid dreaming, is that comfortable with ambiguity and learning to put aside the fear of the unknown so we can, as clearly as possible, see who we're in contact with, and hopefully that the interaction will continue and be impactful and be open to we don't know what's going to happen next. And I think that's the exciting part.
Yeah, those open-ended questions in the dream world can be so powerful if you stay open to the answer to the open-ended things. I want to stay on this subject, but a different part of it for a moment here. So it seems like when Western society and medicine turns its lens towards visionary experiences and extraordinary events, there is this instant cultural bias, skepticism, and stigma. These things are often automatically thrown into the category of myths or chalked up to madness. Western historians and archaeologists are interpreting everything from extraordinary historical accounts to rock art and hieroglyphics from ancient civilizations through what seems to be a pile of often simplistic and reductive cultural presumptions. In Unearthing the Paleolithic Mind, again, you write, quote, "Our ethnocentric concepts of reality are projected into the past as well, informing historical interpretation and archaeological theory," end quote. What do you think we are missing out on with this approach, and what kind of treasures may be hiding in plain sight from these generations long gone?
Oh, that's the pickle. Yeah. Well, let me go back and say that there was a really fascinating paper that just came out in the journal Dreaming about 6 months ago by James Pagel, who is a sleep specialist, a dream worker, dream researcher, and also a rock art enthusiast. He lives in Arizona, and he made the case, I think, pretty impressively for at least one prehistoric rock art piece around Arizona for being a depiction of a nightmare. And he broke down the components of the image, talked about nightmare theory, talked about how nightmare images, what they look like, how we see them cross-culturally. And he basically said we don't often have that ethnographic bridge that we hope for, where indigenous people can say, this is what our rock art means and how we use it, because often that cultural way has been lost. And he says, well, here's one piece of a puzzle. Maybe we can begin doing it through the building blocks of visual imagery itself. And that's another archaeologist, David Lewis Williams. A Cave in the Mind is the book. And he makes a similar case for some of the imagery in Paleolithic caves that is very entoptic. It's very geometrical. There's lots of those basic building blocks of visual imagery, spirals and dots and chevrons and things like that. And he makes the case that these are depictions of altered states of consciousness, which include, and he mostly focuses on the drug-induced states, but of course dreaming and lucid dreams and sleep paralysis and incubus experiences, out-of-body experiences that happen naturally. That's part of the mix too. And so there is a little bit of a movement within cognitive archaeology to have a more sophisticated understanding of consciousness and its constructs, and then applying that back into some of these artifacts that we've been looking at for 100+ years and tried various ways to interpret without really coming up with new questions. And that's, of course, really what makes a nice, successful archaeological case is, do we end up with more questions than we started with? If not, then you're not really going anywhere. So I think in terms of scientific progress, a big piece of it, and I teach this when I lecture to anthropologists and archaeologists when they let me, is that we have to start noticing our biases as researchers. We have to insert ourselves into our research. We have to look at the subjective and our intersubjective experiences and stop sweeping them under the rug. And this is the theme of Alan Wallace's book, The Taboo of Subjectivity, that Western science essentially pretends that it's some sort of, building blocks to heaven and everything's quite orderly, but of course that's not what's happening. Paradigms shift through having a dream, shower thoughts, right? I mean, inspiration happens in unconscious ways that we're not quite aware of yet. And so I try to teach how can we use our own meditations, and there's certain practices that we can do in the field, no matter what we study, if you're an archaeologist or if you're a field worker, or you're interested in literary theory, but noticing your body, doing body meditations, doing journaling, noticing your perceptions, and developing a language for that, so we notice when something unusual occurs in our perception, because that's where there's often new information. And if we don't do this, what happens is that an anomaly will occur to us, a perceptual anomaly, and then we just ignore it or rationalize it, and we rationalize it away. And I've seen this happen for myself. And so there was a case study that I took part of in 2006 where I was doing some field work as an archaeologist, recording petroglyphs on Ometepe Island in Nicaragua. And it was part of Suzanne Baker was getting her dissertation done on that topic. Ometepe Island in Nicaragua is a volcanic island with thousands of pre-Columbian rock art, all carved into basaltic stones that just dot the landscape. It's incredible. It's very trippy. It's very fascinating because the place is just, I'd say, bristling with energy on that level. And one of the things that I was doing on my time off was I was going back to one particular site that was close to where I was staying, and I was visiting it as often as possible and having these extended stay visits with one particular site and getting to know it and doing meditations, doing nature meditations and journaling. And this was coming out of some of Paul Devereaux's work, which he called Earth Seen. And Paul Devereaux is an art historian and an archaeologist that does work on Stonehenge, and he does acoustic archaeology work as well. And he's an editor of Time and Mind, which is a really fascinating journal of consciousness and archaeology and cognition. So I was doing some of this work that was adapted from Paul Devereaux's work, and I was bringing in some of Eugene Gendling's felt sense, getting to know the body sense, becoming aware of body movements and mapping. And I was doing this while at the rock art site just to see what would happen. And one of the things that happened was, and this was in my journal, is that I would notice that there would be a indistinct humming or buzzing sound that was sort of all around me. It wasn't happening over there or over here, but I felt like I was in a field of sound. And I absolutely rationalized it away the first 2 times I experienced it. And I look at my journal and I write, there's a hovering mosquito nearby. And it was really the 3rd time that I experienced it that I finally realized what was happening, which was that I was in a cloud of echo created from a cicada. And the cicada was up in a tree, but because I was in a cluster of boulders, they were creating this really interesting sound bubble. And that cicada sound was ringing back and forth amongst the boulders, and it created a low, like a low-level trance effect. And I would sit and just be in that trance and appreciate that. And so simultaneously, I'm recording my dreams, and recorded a lot of dreams that year in Ometepe. And one of the dreams that I recorded was a lucid dream in which I was drifting down through a void, and there was all kinds of interesting lights. And then there was also a humming sound, again, a very similar vibration kind of sound. And when I had that dream, and then the next time I went out to the field, that's the time that I got it. Oh, I'm experiencing something that's unusual. And so it took the doubling effect for me to notice I was experiencing something. And, long story short, what this helped me think about was there's a whole aspect of Nicaraguan rock art that we don't know about. It's very little research, but we don't know anything about its acoustic properties. And this experience opened me up to the possibility that perhaps there was an acoustic dimension to where the rock art is produced, why it's produced maybe in the first place. There's lots of cupules that were used for grinding or hammering, and it could be that people were hammering to make a trance effect, and that these boulders, some boulders had it, some didn't, that special acoustic setup. And so being open to my experiences, my internal experiences, being open to my dreams, allowed me to formulate a hypothesis that could then be extended into scientific inquiry. And so that's what we want, right? Is we want our perceptions to be fruitful, and they often aren't. And that's what I often get from the scientists when I talk about this, is they say, wow, that sounds really time consuming and it won't necessarily work. And I say, that's probably true, but it's a meditation, it's a practice, it's a way of being, and you'll be a better person.
Yeah, it's so interesting that these paradigms of the people that came before at that point could be so different from ours in the West, that maybe banging on some rocks simultaneously creating an acoustic trance effect and also making drawings and images could have been a really important part of the things that they did during the day, or a meditational kind of thing, like you were saying. So it's so important to be able to keep an open mind to that kind of stuff. It's very cool. We're going to take a little break here. Got a public service announcement. Do you sometimes feel sad? Is your dog barking and just won't shut up? Are there times where you think to yourself, man, I just want a waffle? Well, friends, me too. Now, I don't know if lucid dreaming will help with all of these things, but you know what? Maybe 2 out of 3. And if you ask me, I'll take those odds any day. Is This a Dream? The Lucid Dreaming podcast you can count on always, to make sense at least some of the time. Find us on the web at isthisadreampodcast.com or anywhere you find those quality podcasts. And we are back. You've talked a lot about this autonomous visionary complex that could be a universal neurologic reality for all of us, whether or not we are aware of it at any given time. And this is a self-generating phenomenon that produces everything from geometric imagery to interactive figures or full-on dream and vision scenes with possible layers of meaning and maybe at times even helpful guidance. It would only make sense to assume that all humans back through prehistoric times have experienced this, and it may be directly related to shamanic cognition styles and extraordinary experiences that you talk about back through the ages as well. Why do you think it's important for us to shine a light on this particular thing and maybe further study it?
I think that we come back to ourselves when we do this kind of work. We come back to essentially what's most important to us, which is variable. I mean, at all times, but because we're here now, it's a very critical time to know what's important to us. Geopolitically, this time of history, this time of climate change, climate justice. Knowing ourselves, understanding our apocalyptic visions, aren't necessarily just about midlife crisis, but perhaps about true sensations coming from in a collective sense. Being able to talk about darkness, death, being willing to be transformed in our own dreams, to look in the darkened door, to go down the steps to see what our greatest fear is. I mean, this is how we become courageous. This is how we come to know ourselves. And of course, we come to forgive ourselves. We come to forgive the people in our past who may have harmed us. And all that compassion generating then allows us to do the work that is important right now, which is to live in a way that's sustainable. And so that's why the dream work's always important, but that's why it's important for us right now. I talked earlier about how we're in our own little caves of experience, right? And that's very true. And at the same time, there's something collective going on, and we're part of something bigger. And it's only by understanding our own sense of place can we participate in the larger.
Yeah, that's really important. Ryan, where can people find you, interact, check out your online courses and all your lucid dreaming swag, including the talisman, etc.?
So my blog is dreamstudies.org, and you can also go to lucidtalisman.com to check out our metal necklaces and dream coins that help you remember dreams. So I'd start there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ryan, for taking the time to do this today. This has really been an honor and a privilege to talk with you. I love talking about this stuff. I hope maybe someday we can do a round two. I was thinking, if you're okay with it, I would love to close things out with you reading for us the final paragraph of Unearthing the Paleolithic Mind.
I'd be happy to. So, as a life practice, lucidity is the starting gate, not the goal. Going lucid is actually the easy part. Maintaining it and riding that chaotic wave requires an entirely different skill set that does not lend itself well to marketing lingo and our culture's love of quick fixes. I suspect that many beginner lucid dreamers have given up the quest once they realize that dreaming is not always a pliable virtual reality beyond that initial pleasure dome. The ancient and the mature practice of lucid dreaming, joined once again with the chthonic power of initiatory lucid nightmares and the mythic vitality of those other borderland states of consciousness, it's revealed as a dynamic and a lifelong process. It has ups and downs. To cross the threshold, a lot is expected of the dreamer. Have courage, and just as importantly, have patience. The upshot of all of this is rebirth, renewal, and perhaps an expanded insight into what makes us human.
Oh, thanks so much for sharing that. Ryan, do you have any final thoughts or extra parting words or a message for all the dreamers out there listening today?
I just want to say thanks again for this really wonderful conversation, and I certainly feel more lucid after having it, and so I hope that that effect is felt by others.
I do too. Thanks again, Ryan, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, and it was really a pleasure talking.
All right, thank you.
All right. Well, thanks so much for joining me on the maiden voyage of this podcast. I hope you've enjoyed the journey. I know I've sure had a lot of fun along the way. If you're just starting here, hey, there are 6 more episodes before this one. Go check them out. I might be back with more. We'll see. The best place to check for any updates is the show's Instagram, @isthisadream_. And then also facebook.com/isthisadreampodcast. Okay. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to Is This a Dream? A lucid dreaming podcast. Each episode is written, produced, sound designed, edited, and mixed by me, Adam Cotton. All the music you hear is also written by me. Each episode has a companion blog post with notes and links up at isthisadreampodcast.com. If you're enjoying the show, please leave a review on whatever app you're using. Your ratings and reviews work wonders to help the people who are surfing around find it. Also, please share it with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Until next time, dreamers, I wish you all the best in your nightly journeys. Question reality, and don't forget to enjoy the ride.